All right, what is up, everybody? Mark on the mic here. Across from me, I have Mr. Ike Eastman and Brandon Mason from the iconic Eastmans. You guys have the magazine, you have the podcast, just a multitude of content platforms, historic in the space, providing incredible amounts of detailed information, extremely valuable to the Western hunter. So thank you guys for that.
Yeah, thanks for having us, man.
So thanks for having us, Mark. Appreciate it.
And really, I say all that because I really wanted the free hat.
You just wanted free stuff.
No, I'm kidding. Thank you.
You're just like the kids walking around the shows. You just want free stuff.
Exactly. Got any stickers? And you just mentioned, Brandon, we are at the show. So for those watching or listening, or maybe if you're listening, you hear a little bit of background noise. We're at the Western Hunting Conservation Expo. Really cool show, takes place in Utah, and but we're not here to talk about Utah. We're going to talk a lot about Wyoming. So
there'll be some Utah in here.
Yeah,
we'll talk a little bit about Utah.
Okay.
We share some stuff.
That's true. So. I stand corrected. Idiot.
Sorry, I should have said it.
Start over.
But guys, you're based out of Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty, and then, like you said, Utah, pretty rough winter last winter.
Yeah.
Pretty big impact on all of wildlife. Big game herds, deer, antelope, maybe even elk. I think we'll get there a little bit as well, but. What are you guys seeing? I'm a little bit removed from that. I live in the Midwest. I heard about it, talking with folks that are just like, oh my gosh, we've got 10 feet of snow, like it's crazy. The critters are struggling. What did you guys see, and how did that winter impact, maybe Wyoming specifically, but maybe a lot of the western states, like you said?
So Brandon's a biologist, so I'll let him do all that type of stuff. But
great. Now I'm on record. I have to be official. So much pressure.
You want to talk about something else? CWD? I don't know, something. But what we've noticed, being 3 generations and paying a lot of attention to winters, because in Wyoming they make or break us with our wildlife. It is. You can go from one winter, like last winter, where it was a winter of 100 years, to this winter where we had an extended fall. It was on New Year's Day I was taking Christmas lights off in a T-shirt. This winter.
The contrast is so dramatic.
Yeah.
And honestly, probably thank goodness, right?
Right. Yeah, because they couldn't do 2. So, but, just talking to the biologists that are on the ground, the game and fish, and what happened, a lot of factors happened. Not only was it the amount of snow, but then the temperature as well. So my dad used to say this all the time, or he still says it. He's not dead. He did not die. But he says this all the time. He says, animals can handle.
News.
Yeah. Animals can handle a lot of snow, and they can handle really low temperatures. But when you combine them, it's nasty.
Okay.
So what happened is they got a lot of snow, and then it warmed up. Typically in January, we'll have a warm up. And it warmed up and then got really cold, like really cold, 60 below type cold.
Okay.
And it crusted the top of that snow. What happened? Those deer can't get to the forage underneath the snow because it's crusted, number one. Number two, the predators, which are typically lighter and they have bigger paws, can run on top of the snow, and the deer can't because they're post-holing, belly deep snow. So that's what happened. And there's been a lot of numbers thrown around, but here's a statistic that is 100%. The biologist that checks the deer, there's a 2-week window hunting season out of this area that they call the most iconic mule deer herd in the West, and it's the Red Desert, Region G, Region H in Wyoming. He's been doing this for almost 30 years, and he checks every deer that comes out of there. It's 2 weeks. He sits in a truck at the end, and there's pinch points. You have to go down this road to get out of that.
Gotcha.
So he sits there, and he checks every deer for, age class and maturity and, all the stuff. Not just tags, but that's part of it. Checks every deer. Typically, he will check between 30 and 50 buck deer every season. This year, he did 3. 3 deer. That's it. $3.
Wow.
His number is that 80% of the deer died. You're talking about a deer herd that was 40,000 animals strong is now 4,000 to 6,000 animals.
That's a big hit.
Oh, and we were doing the math on the way down here. So if you take, let's say, 4,000 deer, half of those are does, and then so that 2,000 deer have, let's say they have, they all have twins because this winter is really good.
Mm-hmm.
You start doing the math, it's going to be 10 years before it gets back to the way it was 2 years ago. 10 years.
Under ideal circumstances.
Right.
That's if we don't have another really bad winter.
Right.
And drought problems and all that.
Yep. Under perfect circumstances it's going to take a decade for the bucks that were born this last spring in June to get to maturity and there be enough deer that the herd is back to somewhat normalcy. 10 years.
I mean, that's staggering.
Oh, yeah. It's so staggering, the Game and Fish, they don't really know what to do. And thankfully, they were smart enough that they went to the federal government, and they've got a ton of funding that is coming out of the federal government to help in some of the other factors that we can't affect. We can't affect winter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we can affect migration corridors. We can affect urban sprawl. We can affect, energy development on some of these critical areas. If it's a migration corridor or a wintering range or a summering range, we can affect that. And with those funds, we can build overpasses. Here's a crazy statistic. Before this winter, 80% of the death loss in deer were highway deaths. Deer getting smacked on the winter range because there's a lot of traffic, because that is also where there's a ton of energy development. 80% of them were dying because they're getting hit by vehicles.
Now, is that on average, or is that attributed to the winter because the deer were pushed close to roadways?
That was on average.
Okay.
That statistic was actually before the winter. So
Okay.
it's on average, 80% of them are dying. So if we can fix that, you're going to help that herd significantly. So they're building these huge land bridges over the highways and funneling, with fences, funneling the animals over the highway, which is helping. And they got a ton of federal funding to do way more of that. And the fences. The other thing is a fence. Deer jumping a regular barbed wire fence, there's a lot of death loss there because they get tangled up in it. Whereas if you put a rail or a log on the top, that they're less likely they get tangled up in the wire.
Okay, gotcha. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. I haven't thought about that, but that does.
Yeah. And they can easily clear a cattle fence, right? A barbed wire fence. But if you watch, every animal just barely clears it. Like, I'm only going to jump as high as I really need to.
Mm-hmm.
They can jump a 6-foot tall fence, but if the fence is only this tall, they'll barely clear it, or they'll clip it with their hooves, or then they get tangled up in it and everything.
Oh yeah, I mean, you think of how many times you get to a fence and there's deer hair, in some of the wire on top of the fence, or I've seen deer get spooked, and jump into a fence and then get tangled up, and sometimes they clear it, but you're like, you're walking a little bit different after hitting that fence. So that's cool.
So that winter was significant, and all the other factors hopefully we can help, but that's a problem out west. Now, it's not just Wyoming specifically. We talked about the Red Desert, but they had trouble down here in Utah. Now, here's the difference. Utah took the adage a number of years ago that they were going to feed the deer. If there's problems, we're going to feed them.
Gotcha.
Now I'm going to let Brandon tell us why the pluses and minuses of feeding deer, but Wyoming decided we're not feeding them.
Interesting. Okay.
We can, but we're not going to.
Two very different strategies. Obviously, everybody has the same goal of, we want to benefit and support our wildlife. But what's going on there, Brandon?
So there's a lot of different sides to the conversation, and that's why it gets so heated, is because you have states like Utah did some supplemental feeding this past winter, and the success of that to get those deer through the winter was noticeable and high.
Significant.
And Wyoming didn't, and we're just picking on these two states right now, Wyoming didn't do supplemental feeding for the most part for the deer specifically. And we just talked about the numbers, the results. So some of the pluses are, on the surface, you think feeding deer to get them through a tough winter is good. I mean, look at the two states. I mean, they share a border and night and day difference, right? Survivability. And you make that case, and it could be a good argument. And so I'm just so everybody knows with this one, I'm being Switzerland here, okay? I'm not promoting one way or the other. Now, on the flip side of that, when you start feeding wildlife, particularly big game, they get pre-programmed then for potentially generations after that to come back to those areas. And if you don't continue to supplement, you've essentially created a death trap for those animals because they can come there looking for the food, and they come so far sometimes to look for that food. If it's not there, they may not have the energy reserves to leave there and go look for food elsewhere. So that's a problem, right? Potentially. Another potential problem is their concern, of course, with CWD and everything else.
Just as far as
disease
like deer,
transmission,
like concentrating,
right.
being close proximity, and disease transmission.
Nose-to-nose contact, and fecal matter, and all that stuff that so it's not an ideal circumstance, and so that's the argument. I mean, I used to work for the wildlife agency in North Dakota, and I was at the beginning of my seasonal time there, and when I was still in college, we were still feeding whitetail deer to get them through the tough North Dakota winters. Well, then all of a sudden, around 2000-ish, the big scare of CWD. I mean, they knew about CWD before that, but it was like this panic, 20-some years ago about it. And so we're like, no more artificial feeding. I mean, it was getting, they're trying to make it even, not illegal, but educate people. Don't even put bird feeders up.
Gotcha.
Like artificially congregating wildlife's a bad idea. Don't do it. So rip the Band-Aid off, pulled all the feeders off of management areas. Neighboring landowners were mad because then they're in their silage piles and they're in their hay field or their hay yard, and the Game and Fish wasn't able anymore because they changed their policy to keep the deer on the management area. Because what was happening, they had radio collar deer that in states like out on the prairie are considered non-migratory, different than Wyoming, different than Utah. Non-migratory deer herds, because they're not migrating through from high elevation to low. But in the wintertime, they were seeing deer that were radio collared up by the Canadian border that would end up wintering down by South Dakota. I mean, traveling almost a whole state to find food in certain winters. And so they will go to drastic measures to survive like we would, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the sides, I mean, there's even way more intricacies to each one of those sides, but so that's the fight, the public and some agencies are like, no, we got to feed, because without this, we're not going to get these populations, a high percentage of them through. Instead of a 90% death rate, it would be maybe a 40% death rate.
Right.
It decreases it. But then the other side goes, but if we're artificially congregating animals because of the food supply, they survive that winter, but how many contracted, say, CWD from each other, and then they go out and disperse to their own areas again? Do we just make a bad problem even worse? And the problem is, I don't think anybody has the crystal ball perfect answer. I
was going to say, I look at both those things, and there's merit to both strategies, and I couldn't tell you which one is the right one. Like we talked about earlier. Okay, you don't feed. You do get that winter 2 years in a row.
Right.
Now what?
And then some people will say, and I think if I had to pick a side, this is probably where I gravitate towards now. My opinion on this has changed in my professional career big time. Mm-hmm. It's been all over. Part of it is new information comes out.
Sure.
So I didn't know that. That makes sense.
I think we need to be, I think sometimes as humans we forget that the ability to, change your mind.
Right.
Even if it's something you've been advocating for, potentially publicly, I think, to be able to grow with that. And it might change again. But anyway, where are you going, Brandon?
And maybe biologists look at this as it's a practice. It's not set in stone. They're practicing wildlife management, meaning we're doing this and it's working now, but we may have to change it. We may learn new things.
That's the best information we have today.
Right.
And so we're going to go with that because you can't do nothing, right? And where I land on it now, and again, I might change 5 minutes from now if I learn something new, but there's guarantees and there's what ifs. Mm-hmm. If we, like a winter like last winter, and the animals are going to die. That's 100% guarantee if they don't get help. They may die if they get fed and disease transmission and distributed out further. That's a maybe. I'd kind of like to bet on the sure thing. And it's like, well, I know that if we help them now, they're going to at least get through now. Mm-hmm. And maybe that short-sightedness. I'm not a governor. I'm not a director of a game and fish department, so it's easy for me to say, well, my opinion is this is what we should do. But if you just ask me today, and that's a different answer that I would have given you 15 years ago. But I'm just like, well, I know for sure they're going to die if they're not going to get helped now. with supplemental feeding or whatever, like a winter like last winter. And maybe they will contract something from another deer, and maybe they'll transfer it to other places, and maybe they won't survive that. But I know they're going to die,
right,
if they're not helped.
So then, like you said, and maybe long term, that's not the right call. It's super tricky.
Yeah.
Brandon, do you know, like nature, pretty brutal, right? I mean, truly, only the strong survive, right? Do you know? Or is there any data pointing to like last winter, very extreme? But my goodness, if you were a deer or an antelope that made it through, you were probably a tough son of a gun, right?
Right on. Yeah.
Is there benefit to having that genetic, that DNA move forward? Have we ever seen like overall health of a deer improve after a massive hit like last winter?
That's what the theory is. I don't think there's like definitive 100% you can say that. But even if it's not a sort of weeding out the weak genetic ones, maybe that happened, maybe it doesn't. But either way, which coming into this winter now, well, actually last summer and fall and this winter, where we got off all this snow that was out there, tons of moisture, which places like Wyoming don't get normally, a ton of moisture. So like we always say, the groceries were better than they've been in a long time. There were fewer animals competing for those groceries. So the animals that did survive, maybe because they're genetically superior, maybe they're just healthier and they were able to get through a tough time, or maybe they were lucky, maybe, who knows. But those animals and what they're going to benefit from all these groceries that are there now, it's tremendous. And so hopefully those are the strong ones that are, if it is genetic, they're passing on their genes. And if it's not genetic, either way, they're going to be really robust and healthy to bolster that population quicker if conditions continue to be favorable for them.
Right. Or maybe even make it through if they go into a tough winter in super great shape, they're more likely to make it through again, hopefully, I guess.
Yeah. And that's where they are right now. Which there's two things I want to bring up. Number one, that deer have naturally they have twins, sometimes triplets and quadruplets. And then as the winter goes, and depending on how bad the winter is in the spring, they will slough some of those fetuses and end up with one or none.
Okay.
So a lot of those does, one of the problems in our little math project is a lot of those does didn't have fawns last spring.
Gotcha.
They sloughed them all off. So their fawn recruitment is almost zero.
Even a doe that made it through,
she may not have
didn't have fawns.
Wow. So
that didn't even cross my mind.
So the other thing that happened is they didn't have that extra mouth to feed in the summer. So they're stacking on their groceries coming into this winter, and the winter wasn't bad. I mean, that's going to help a lot. Now, we're not having a bad winter so far. Now, it's the middle of February. We have a lot of winter left, but we have a lot of time left. But she could breed and have triplets, which changes the math again, because the winter's not that bad. She's not going to slough all those fetuses off. The other thing that I want to talk about with feeding that these guys, the biologists, are all arguing about is, yes, if we supplemental feed, we can guarantee, or not guarantee, but at least we get them through that winter. What about, Brandon, is it that if they come through that winter and we supplemental feed and they're healthier, will that disease not affect them as bad?
Well, I think it would be dependent on what type of disease. I mean, obviously CWD is the thing that everybody talks about now, but I mean, that's just one of a ton of things, just like humans. I mean, we get sick from a lot of different things. Obviously, if I'm thinking from a human standpoint, if I am a single guy that's pretty healthy and all my resources, both financially and physically, can go into taking care of myself, and I don't have kids to take care of, and I don't have stresses in my life, and naturally, I'm going to be more resistant, probably, unless I'm genetically predisposed to get something. But I mean, just on, say, a high-level conversation, not getting into the weeds and stuff that we wouldn't really know, but I would be better able to fight off that sort of thing. Now, like, say, stuff with CWD, sometimes we forget it's not a virus.
Right.
Right.
You're right.
That's a whole
That's
different. It's a whole different animal that we're talking about. That my contention with CWD, because I've written a bunch of blogs and articles or whatever in our media about it is some people, even people that know me really well, think this has become this flag that I'm carrying, that I don't agree with anything the state agencies are doing. And that's just 100% not true. What I don't like is when people make rash decisions on incomplete information. Now, like we said, wildlife management is kind of a practice. The more we learn, the more they change and modify, and that's a good thing, right? But when it's landscape scale, talking about, killing deer on the winter range to stop CWD spreading, well, I know killing them is 100% death rate. Maybe they would be resistant to CWD, which is a whole other topic of contention and people argue about. But I guess let's go with for sure what we know. And then the stuff that we don't know, keep studying it. I applaud all those agencies for doing that, and not make these rash decisions on what ifs and maybes. When I read state game and fish management plan for their mule deer herds, and I hear could possibly, might, maybe, there's no definitive statements, but they're making very definitive decisions off of what ifs. That's when my hackles get raised.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of sportsmen are upset about too, is I think the agencies have a communication problem. I've told some of my good friends that still work in the agencies, we're all, we still hunt together and we hang out and everything, that an agency's idea of, well, we got to get the word out. Well, let's start our own podcast. Well, let's write this article that nobody's going to read.
Yeah.
Or you could get the word out to people with giant audiences, like in Eastmans, or then there's plenty of people in this world, right? Feed them that information so that we can have the best information, and we're not Monday morning quarterbacking it and acting like an upset guy because we don't have the information, And I think they're getting better at it. It's a learning experience for everybody, but it's a tough topic. I say routinely, is like we spin our theories around the office and everything, and we should write this or talk about that. And I'm like, man, I sure am glad that I'm not the guy that has to actually make that call, though.
Yeah.
Right.
And maybe that's chicken of me to say that, but I'm just being honest. It's like, man, it's a
tough
scary
spot.
decision.
Yeah, feed or not to feed? Ooh, glad I didn't have to make that call.
Yeah.
Well, and you might be right now, wrong 10 years down the road, but then like we're talking, you don't feed. Well, you have a deer herd that's compromised for the next 10 years. Like it's tricky. Yeah, like you said, and I don't know. I don't have the answers.
There's a couple other interesting things that happened in that winter that I didn't know. I was talking to my dad recently, who, he's 75 years old, and he has dedicated his life to wildlife, literally, and he loves the student of it.
Mm-hmm.
He was telling me that, in a winter, back, let's say in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, those deer, if they struggled in the red desert, I'm just once again talking about Wyoming. If they struggled in the red desert to find food, or they had a situation like last winter, they would keep migrating. You were talking about going, from the Canadian border to South Dakota. They'd keep migrating, and they'd end up here in Utah. And because Utah is lower elevation, Salt Lake, it's raining. It's 15th of February, and it's raining outside. It is not raining where I'm from. It is snowing.
Sure.
So it's a lot different. They would just keep just move with that snow line, and then move back humans came in and they put this giant barrier.
There's a few obstacles in the way.
It's called I-80.
Yeah.
And it's constant truck traffic, and there's 16-foot fences all the way from the Utah border all the way to Rock Springs, and it cut that off. So those deer couldn't migrate down here. So that's another problem. Now, there are deer that did migrate. They recently found a couple of our collared deer here in Utah. They migrated all the way down here, got fed from Utah, and then migrated back to Wyoming. That's a long ways.
Interesting.
Hundreds of miles.
That is incredible.
Yeah, and you think of the man-made barriers that happen so slowly over time. And, in our lifetimes, the interstate was always there, right?
Yeah.
And so to us, it's like, well, it's always been there.
Right.
Well, no, it hasn't always been there.
It wasn't there 100 years ago when the winter was like this 100 years ago.
Right? Exactly. And so you're putting up these barriers, obviously not intentionally putting up barriers for wildlife, but that's what they become because of the way things grow with human cultures and everything. And it's kind of like putting a barricade on your house when you're trying to leave the house that's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
oh, you needed to get out of there? Huh, I didn't know that, barred up wall would infringe on you getting through there. And that's kind of the same thing. They just can't get, and it's not a frantic overnight, they got to get there. But you imagine an animal that's stressed, coming through the rut and hunting seasons and a migration, and then they get down to where they're supposed to be safe in the winter. They're already stressed. They're already going into energy reserves, and then they got to keep moving and keep moving. I mean, you know what it's like when you're hunting, and you think, oh, I think there's a water source down that drainage so I can go filter water. And the last little bit of energy you have from your hike into the backcountry, you're like, I know there's a water hold on, I'm going to go filter. And your last little bit of energy, you get down there, and it's dry that year. And you're like, I don't think I can make it to the one that's 3 miles away.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
What I'm going to do. I mean, and that's essentially what the deer did. They're not consciously thinking that, but that's essentially what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure state agencies, are factoring that in. But I mean, yeah, that's a huge consideration. Like you said, like we can either, and I still in this conversation, I don't know where I fall on. Not that this podcast is only about feeding or not feeding, but that is a big consideration to keep in mind as you make those decisions. Like you said, it's either a death sentence or.
And one thing that we haven't talked about that I just remembered is, like mentioned, the federal funding that agencies can get now to help mule deer, because it's a panic attack now to save mule deer herds across the West. And so finally there's federal money, and there's a lot of it, because with the state agencies managing it on their own, there is never going to be enough money to do that. And then on top of that, they don't want to, even if the right answer is to cut tags drastically, which a lot of them do, but even if that's the right answer, it's hard because their budgets are dependent on that.
Right.
And I mean, it's just this cycle that it's hard, and it's easy for us to armchair quarterback it and castrate them verbally for making whatever decision they make, but they're dealing with a lot of these periphery discussions too that we're just not even privy to.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, you bring up, tags and hunting. Hunting didn't stop. I think in some areas that were affected, tags, reduced or adjusted, to varying degrees. One thing I wanted to talk about, last year, I was really, I was like, I'm going to burn my antelope points. Well, by just circumstance, I had other stuff, other hunts. I'm like, yeah, I'll, hold on to them again. But now it's like, so where, for people who want to hunt, what do you think, and I guess, maybe we'll speak specifically to Wyoming now, what do you think that strategy should be? I know guys in various Western states that self-regulate, they still hunted, but they're like, you know what, it's going to have to be something pretty special. I don't just need to shoot a deer, and a lot of them ended up not shooting deer when they could have shot deer, right? So we had some self-regulation there as well. But what would be a strategy for a person? Maybe they've got some points, they're thinking about burning them. Is that oh, we talked about 10 years. Oh, now I need to wait another 10 years, or does it depend on the areas? Which areas were maybe affected more? What's going on there? For a person that goes, I'm going to try and I'd like to hunt Wyoming, but I'm not sure what to do.
What we're telling people, because we get that question asked of us a lot because of the research our crew does, is specifically for deer, wait.
Okay.
Wait. And I know that's not the answer that everybody wants to hear, but it's kind of like what we were saying, how the biologists manage on here's the information we have today, and that might change tomorrow, so we got to be flexible, right, and change our plans. And that's the way hunters need to be nowadays with application strategies, because sometimes, maybe it's a unit you've hunted before, so you're just like, I know that area, I don't want to learn a new area, but if you stick to that mindset, you're either not going to draw tags for a very, very long time, or when you do draw them, you're going to have a terrible hunt because population numbers changed. I've hunted Region G a ton. I've hunted Region H a ton. And it is not remotely on my radar to go down there and hunt anymore. Scott Reeker's on our team.
That's your home state?
That's our home state. It's a general tag for us.
It's over the counter for us.
Yeah.
And it's not going to happen because it's not, from the selfish standpoint, from our standpoint, the fall is so short, you got to make your time count anyway. So it's I'm not going to go spend a week in an area where there's no deer. Plus, self-regulation, you're like, well, even if there was, I'd feel bad for even
they're already compromised.
Yeah. And Scott Reeker's on our crew. He grew up in Rock Springs, and he knows those mountains so well, better than most in our office. And I think this past fall was the first fall in his life that he did not, and he's just turned 40. And first fall in his life that he didn't go into Region G. You want to talk about a hard decision for a guy. That's his stomping grounds.
Yeah.
That's all. That's like your favorite whitetail spot in Wisconsin or whatever. It's like, that's what I know. Mm-hmm. And not going to go.
Tag Hub, we have a online research tool that breaks all the states down called Tag Hub. And the guys that, like Wyoming, my brother writes Wyoming, and this is his data, and he's telling people, wait, now there's guys that are writing like Idaho and Utah, Colorado. There's pockets in Idaho that weren't affected much by our winter. You southern Wyoming or southern Idaho, not that affected. Northern Idaho got hammered, but southern not too bad. Wyoming, our northern part of Wyoming didn't get that bad.
Okay.
Like where we live, we had a winter, but it wasn't as bad as down south. Down here, it was bad. Southern Utah didn't get hammered like northern Utah did. So there's pockets. There is. But the key is, you got to do your research, and you got to be willing to go, I'm not learning a new area. I'm going to wait 5 years, 7 years, or I have the time. If you're 55 and you're sitting on max points, you may consider putting in one of those pockets, because 10 years, you may not physically be able to do it.
Sure.
Or you go with an outfitter, one of those, which isn't bad. There's places for outfitters too. They provide a hell of a service, logistically, if nothing else. But yeah, you get on Tag Hub and you do that research and find out where those pockets are if you're really wanting to burn points. You're talking about antelope points. I self-regulated last year. I drew an antelope tag in Wyoming, and I put in with my oldest daughter. It was her first antelope hunt, and we drew it on a party tag. She did kill an antelope. I saw a couple bucks I would have shot, but I couldn't do it. I'm like, that might be the only buck in this area breeding all these does.
Right.
I'm not doing that. So self-regulating. And there were some pretty cool guys. There's a guy in Pinedale that put on a deal that if you sent him your deer tag unmarked, he put you in for a huge gift package. It was like $100,000 worth of stuff.
Oh my gosh.
Tons of gear. He got a bunch of companies like Vortex or whoever donate optics, donate everything that he could, weapons, everything that he could give away as like a giant gear giveaway raffle, and your raffle ticket was an unpunched deer tag. So you bought the tag.
So the Game and Fish still gets some money
to conservation.
Right. Yep.
But then you handed it in saying, like, this is bigger than me, basically, and that was your raffle ticket to win just a ton of gear, which that just shows that's hands-on, on the ground, sportsman caring, trying to help agencies. Because sometimes we think, well, there's wildlife agencies. I don't need to do anything. I'm a plumber, or whatever. It's like, no, but man, you as a plumber can get involved in nonprofit groups. We're here at the Western Hunting Conservation Expo. Everybody calls it Hunt Expo, and it's nonprofit conservation groups coming together to do just that. Everybody walking around this show is Joe Blow hunter that just cares about the resource. In fact, I got in a fight with somebody in a hotel.
Almost physically.
Yeah, I have gotten in a physical altercation since I was a kid. And these guys were obviously not hunters, and they were really curious as to, one of the guys was really nice, the other guy was not nice. And they're from the East Coast somewhere. I think they're out here skiing or something. And we started talking, and I was telling them the North American model of wildlife conservation. It was going, we thought, very well. And one of the guys was really engaged, and something, I don't know if it was liquid courage or something in this guy's brain or what happened. He didn't seem intoxicated to me, but all of a sudden he flat out, he asked me a question. I said, well, that's kind of an immeasurable thing I can't quantify that for you. He goes, so you don't know bleep?
Oh, yeah. I'm
like, what? And you don't know bleep? And I said, you're lucky you're not talking to the 21-year-old me right now. I'd punch your lights out. That's what I said to him. And the bartender behind the counter, he was sweeping up. It was almost closing time. And it wasn't that late. It was like 11 o'clock or something like that. And this place closed down early. He's sweeping up, and he goes, looks up like, oh no, I'm going to have to call the cops.
The last three guys in here are going to get in an altercation.
He's like, I'm almost done cleaning up.
And it was all about essentially deer management. And this guy was coming at it from an anti-hunting standpoint.
Right.
And I thought it was a very civil discussion for a long time, and we have a lot of those discussions, but it went south pretty fast.
Well, Brandon, how dare you use science, logic, and reason?
Yeah, we do this emotionally around here.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit of antelope, and I think that's a great story of self-regulation. Like, you still got to hunt. You hunted with your daughter.
Yep.
Like, that's, at this stage of our lives, that's a more important experience.
100%.
You by the state, they're doing this stuff smartly too. They allocated you that tag, but you took it and you're like, I'm gonna pull back the reins a little bit, and I think that's super cool. What is the antelope story the same as the deer story, or the same regions that you talked about that affected the deer? I mean, I know they inhabit, a lot of sometimes overlap as far as habitat, but differences as well. So what's going on there?
They, antelope and specifically in Wyoming, but our antelope and deer cohabitate the same place in the winter typically.
Okay, gotcha.
They migrate out to the plains in the winter. The other problem that our antelope had is what was the disease? They lost thousands of antelope from a disease even before the winter.
Yeah, some of them around the Pinedale area got pneumonia, so they were already stressed. And then they got pneumonia and just wiped out a giant segment of the population.
Dude, absolute double whammy.
It was so bad that we were at state soccer. My kids play soccer, and we were at state soccer in southern Wyoming. Drove home through that area in May. It was like driving through an animal waste dump. It smelled horribly. You're driving down the highway for an hour and a half. That's how many animals were dead everywhere, and they were, it was warming up and rotting out. It was unreal.
Devastating.
Yes.
Yeah, basically anything south of the Casper, Wyoming to Shoshone Highway south were pretty devastated. I hunted just south of a unit that butts up to that highway because a couple of my daughters drew antelope tags. We went down there. One of them had a deer tag also. And we were pleasantly surprised in that area, the amount of deer. That was encouraging. I didn't expect that. We honestly went down there to do a glorified camping trip, figured we probably wouldn't see much and self-regulate, right? Well, there's a good population of mule deer. So I'm like, all right, well, hopefully we can get you a buck. And we didn't see an antelope. And that's a unit that there's antelope everywhere usually.
It's actually the largest antelope herd in Wyoming.
And we didn't see an antelope.
Wow.
And I've hunted there. Oh, in fact, the film that we produced with TRCP 2 falls ago called Paper Trails, that's the unit that I killed my buck in.
Okay.
And then go back the very next year, not an antelope. Didn't see one.
Yeah. I mean, it's in that area. They have 1,500 tags in that area. Used to.
Yeah.
1,500 tags. So, there's a lot of antelope.
Yeah. Not to, I guess in doing this, maybe it's impossible, but not to put, regions on blast. But are there any, bright spots where a person that says, I do want to burn my points?
Northeast Wyoming. For antelope, northeast Wyoming. Didn't get hammered as bad. They got moisture, but they got moisture at the right times, and that herd did really well. And they're easier tags to draw, actually. Okay. It's a lot more struggling because of public land versus private. There's a lot more private land over there and a lot more landlocked land. But that if you were like, I want to shoot an antelope, I would go there.
Okay, gotcha. What about I've heard the elk suffered a little bit less. Is that true? Or, is that still whatever your plan was before, stay the course, or what's that looking like?
Yeah, so in doing this research, my brother on Tag Hub, he's like, the elk herd didn't get affected hardly at all.
Okay.
But they feed them. There's, I don't know how many, 40? I think there's 40 feed grounds
a lot.
in Wyoming that they feed
Wyoming.
The elk every winter.
Okay.
And they have for a long time because, here's a funny story most people don't know. My family, I'm fifth generation Wyoming, and my grandfather grew up in the 20s on a ranch in Wyoming, and it was the 100 years ago winter, and it was horrific, and they weren't feeding the elk. The elk were in everybody's haystacks. He told stories. They lived about 20 miles out of town. He told stories that on the weekends when he'd go home, because he would stay in town for school, he could walk from elk carcass to elk carcass all the way home. Literally killed them all. So the ranchers got around and said, listen, let's get these elk off our cows' feed ground, put them out here, and we'll feed them. And so they started feeding them. That's the National Elk Refuge outside Jackson.
Okay, gotcha.
The state also maintains about 30-some elk feed grounds all over Wyoming, and that's how they've kept the most pure elk herd in the world alive, and they've done it for decades, hundreds of years. Back to what Brandon was talking about, if you pulled that away, and there is a contention of people that are like, well, we got to get rid of these elk feed grounds and disease, all what we just talked about. If you did that now, you'd kill them all.
I mean, you're trading, like you said, a big what if for absolute certainty of not a positive outcome.
Yeah, you have 10 to 15 generations of elk that have been going to those feed grounds every winter. Not only would you kill those elk, but the elk that did survive, they would go to where the deer winter, and they would be competing with our deer on the same habitat because they eat the same stuff in the winter. And it would demolish the deer and antelope as well.
Right. And then you look at I think from what I understand, oftentimes an elk will outcompete a mule deer.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
So then they're at a disadvantage.
They're 4 times the size.
Yeah.
They take a lot more groceries.
It's kind of like when you're fishing for perch. And I don't know if you've ever spearfished, ice fishing, and you got this giant hole, and you're waiting for a northern to come in, and you got your perch decoy down there, and you see other fish swimming around, and they're just doing fish things. It's like watching TV, and all of a sudden everything goes,
right?
And you're like,
where'd everybody
what,
go?
did somebody drop a bomb down there or what? And then you slowly, it's like you're tree stand hunting, you got to be careful, not move too much. And you look and you can see the front end of a northern just kind of hovering there, and he's checking out your decoy.
Right.
Whether he's going to hammer it or not, and then you spear him. And I look at elk as like the northern, of the woods.
Right.
Is that when they move in, everything's like, boom.
Yeah.
I'm out.
They do not cohabitate very well.
Yeah.
So they feed them. So they didn't get affected.
Okay.
Hardly at all, actually.
And maybe that's, like with, you take Wyoming and Utah, you have some A/B testing there. And then you also have some A/B testing, different species with, mule deer and the elk of Wyoming, same state, different outcomes. The elk seem to be still flourishing. So I don't know, and like I said, I'm not taking a side right now, but again, just trying to use all the information that we have at hand, some things to think about.
Yeah.
So.
And sometimes what may work in a western state because of the challenge with topography and everything, maybe it isn't a good idea to do in Wisconsin.
Sure. Right.
And so sometimes we'll get lambasted on a blog or something about feed grounds where we're pro elk feed grounds, say, in a certain blog from a Midwestern person that, thinks supplemental feeding is just part of the Antichrist or something. It's like you can't, you just don't do that. It's like, well, but it's not the same there as it is here. There's different challenges and
exactly.
And,
it's not like a blanket.
Yeah, it's not a cookie cutter recipe for it.
Yeah, interesting.
And there's a different, the one thing that we didn't really talk about is deer don't adjust quickly. Elk don't either, but they don't adjust quickly going from natural forages to feed. They don't. It stresses them out. Mm-hmm. There's a guy that ran the Wyoming Game and Fish elk feed ground program for decades, and he retired and he wrote this big long article, and you can look at it on our blog. He did the study on how long it takes, and it's up to a week for them to be able to. They'll eat it, but they don't digest it because the bacteria and stuff in their stomach's different.
They have to transition.
Back into eating that type of forage. I think it was a week, wasn't it? It's like 4 or 5 days.
I think it's at least that. Well, think of it this way. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Anybody's gone on a massive cleansing diet type thing. Yeah. I've done that Whole30 challenge a few times where you eat nothing but whole foods for 30 days. And it's cold turkey, man. And I'm used to, now I drink, bubbly water because it's not as bad as drinking Coca-Cola like I used to so much. But it was
Is that a shameless plug?
Yeah, it was. This podcast sponsored by LaCroix. Not a sponsor yet. But we cold turkeyed it and went from candy bars and junk food and all sorts of stuff. Like my wife and I were like, man, as we age and all of a sudden weight comes on that wasn't there before, we're like, we need to take better care of ourselves. Cold turkey it. And first it's like the cravings are there, so you're kind of hangry, but by day 4, you're eating healthy food, and it's this monster cleanse, to put it as G-rated as I know how to put it.
Right.
Not pleasant. Like tackling somebody to get them out of the way of the bathroom.
The G stands for gastrointestinal.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, it was, and it's
how many bathrooms do we have? Is it enough?
Yeah, And so you think of it that way. I mean, humans are the same thing. It's so different that we eat our normal foods, and then you go up into the mountains and you're eating, say, Mountain House or any of the freeze-dried foods, and your body's just not, and you're eating more granola bars than you usually do on a day-to-day basis, and we blame it on, say, the Mountain House type foods. And maybe that's not the problem. It's that we're putting so much other weird stuff in our guts, and it takes days, if not a couple weeks, to fully adjust to that.
That's interesting.
And the animals got to go through the same thing. And in fact, when I was still in my game and fish days, we had a call from a farmer who said there's a dead cow elk in an area where there's not normally elk, but it was in the wintertime. There's a dead cow elk in my lot, a feed lot or whatever. And so one of my coworkers went up to check on it, and this cow died of a full belly of corn.
Right.
She couldn't digest it. She was bloated and just nasty, and she was full. She was eating, but she basically died of starvation. She couldn't process it, couldn't pass it, couldn't. And that's what the other side is also concerned about with feeding. And one thing we didn't talk about either, that we talked about the game and fish agencies are really limited on budget to do these mass landscape scale management things. Another reason why some of the proponents to stop the feeding programs is just the sheer cost of it.
Okay. It's a lot of money. That's a lot of mouths.
Yeah, you see both sides.
You're balanced. They're balancing a lot of things, and no matter what way you go, there's going to be compromises.
Right.
Any way you slice
and everybody's
it,
got strong opinions on it.
Yeah. That's right.
Well, the good news is, at least this winter that we're having right now, up to now, is literally a bright spot. A little bit more sun, a little bit less snow, good amounts of moisture, it seems. So hopefully, these populations that were impacted are on the mend, and maybe we can get a few more winters like this to help them along their way. And appreciate all the insightful information you guys have on that and things that impact these populations, as well as a little bit of things for us hunters to be thinking about as we plan our hunts for the future. So
I appreciate it. Appreciate you having us on, and your audience understanding that this is a thing, and it is. There's no simple answer. There isn't one. They don't exist.
Yeah, and the key is just stay informed. Like I take my kids with me to public game and fish meetings in our county, in our area when they have them, whether it's about deer management or grizzly bear delisting or whatever. And I tell them, this is what North America does. This is active participation in the management process. We get a say. We get to, and if nothing else, even if you don't want to say, be informed. What the information is. So, and us doing what we do as a media company, we're not always right about what we put out there, but it's what we knew at the time,
right?
And we're passionate about it. And so, take what we say, and take what the agencies say, and take what other media companies say, and take what you guys are saying. And after a while, you get a lot of, like we always say at the office, a lot of data points on the graph. And pretty soon, they're forming clusters that are telling a story, and then you can be an informed voter or an informed member of going to a public meeting or whatever, and talking to people in a facility like I did last night, trying to let them know how it actually works,
right,
and not emotion.
Yeah.
So.
No, I like it. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hopefully you found this as just interesting as I did, as well as, maybe like I said, plan your hunts for the future. I think this winter is a bright spot in our hunting future, and hopefully we can get a couple more like we talked about. And until next time, we'll catch you on the next one. We'll talk to you later. Bye.